I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. The fighting may have temporarily eased in the Middle East, but the fallout is still moving through the global economy. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted. Fuel markets are unsettled, and Australia is exposed. Now, Anthony Albanese is in Singapore, trying to secure supply, as the opposition presses the government over how prepared the country really is. Today, Energy and Climate Change Senior Fellow at the Grattan Institute, Tony Wood, on the state of the Strait and the ongoing risks for Australia and the politics taking shape around another global shock. It's Saturday, April 11.
Okay, Ellie, I have to pause because I'm just hearing in my ear that the president has agreed to stop bombing for 2 weeks. Control room, do you have any more information?
Iran's foreign minister confirming the reopening of the critical Strait of Hormuz during this ceasefire period. But tonight,
Tony, this ceasefire has raised hopes that the Strait of Hormuz could reopen, but there are still reports that ships need permission from Iran's navy to pass and that shipping's at a near standstill. So firstly, is Hormuz actually open in any sort of meaningful sense?
Half open, half closed. I think it's obviously just reflecting a lot of the tension that's still both sides of the conflict negotiating their position. I mean, Chris Bowen said it accurately. Let's not get too carried away that it's all going to be open, but it is heading in a better direction.
Obviously, we hope a ceasefire takes hold and becomes, the permanent arrangement, obviously. And the sooner that happens, the better it'll be for fuel prices around the world. If you're asking me to, say with a great deal of certainty to predict events in the Middle East in coming days and weeks, I'm not going to do that because it's a fast-moving situation.
But boy, this could easily tip either way, I still think, given what's going on. So what that means is that, the things that the government's been doing almost have to continue on the basis that nothing's changed yet.
If it's not really open, what would companies need to see before traffic starts moving properly again?
Look, I think there's two things. One is the actual shipping. If the strait is open and there's no other impediment, then that shipping could start pretty quickly. When there's a whole lot of ships basically sitting there waiting to go. There's a debate going on about whether or not Iran might, apparently there's evidence they've already tried to change some sort of tolling fee to use the strait, and that would be something everyone's going to react adversely to. Any fuel that's already on the way, this is an issue our government in Australia had already been concerned about. But if people were buying fuel at $110, $120 a barrel, but by the time the ship arrived to Australia, the price has dropped to $80 a barrel, you can see there's a bit of a commercial exposure there, and the government had looked to even underwrite that risk. And then the other one, of course, is has there been any significant physical damage to the resources, to the facilities in the Persian Gulf? Because there certainly has been to the LNG production from the gas field in the Qatari field. And so that's a big problem because that's going to take, people have said, more than 3 to 5 years to get some of that fixed. Now, it's not the whole thing, but that would be a problem. So it's a bit unclear as to whether there are physical constraints on that. And then you've got the fact that, it takes a long time to fill up a global supply chain. So it's not going to happen overnight, but, the prices react very quickly. And we've seen that already up and down. And I think we'd see some improvement in price pretty quickly if it became clear that the strait was going to effectively stay open.
Just to give us a sense of how important the strait is, Tony, when it is open, what does it mean in market terms? And when it does properly reopen, sometime in the hopefully not too distant future, when will we start to see sort of any real impact here in Australia in terms of our fuel security?
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, about 20% of the world's crude oil comes through the strait. Now, only a modest proportion of that is Iranian oil. Iran, together with Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, have the big resources globally of oil. Most of what Iran has exported has been going to China in recent times, but what has been prevented by the Strait of Hormuz problem isn't Iranian oil, it's oil coming from Kuwait, Saudi, and those sort of places. And not just the oil, by the way, it's also things like fertiliser. So that's been the big problem. Now, if that opens up, then you would start to see that flowing. Now, what Australia's been doing, we've depended upon countries like Singapore and Malaysia, to a smaller extent Japan, for our finished products and also for our crude oil that goes through our 2 refineries. We've already diversified that a fair bit over the last 20 years as we shut down our refineries. Obviously, this is giving us a reason to even think about it more so, and maybe the relationships with some of those countries who we see as strong long-term energy partners will mean we'll get more from them, but also recognise that countries like Singapore and Malaysia themselves are dependent upon getting the crude, which they refine into end products from places like the Middle East. And so I think this complex global supply chain of liquid fuel products is going to change a lot. And what people we depend upon and those we don't depend upon is going to change a lot. And at the same time, we are and will be and should be looking forward to, okay, now what do we have to be thinking about, almost at the same time, to ensure that we don't become complacent if things return to something like normal.
Our Prime Minister has to fly halfway around the world to beg for liquid fuels, which is what he's had to do in this last-minute flight to Singapore today. We should instead have been drilling for the last few decades. We probably would have found a new source of liquid fuels to replace the Bass Strait just a generation ago.
Is all of this, Tony, as the opposition is suggesting, a case for more domestic refining, bigger reserves and different trading partnerships, or all three?
Look, I think the trading partnerships makes a lot of sense. I think the idea that we're going to rapidly find more oil and build more refineries is far more challenging. It seems to me that's a very big ask and would require huge amounts of government effort, because we already know the reason we don't have refineries is because they're uneconomic. So building new refineries for a market that's relatively small like Australia, with physically spread around a very large country with a small population, is a really big, hard thing to do. There's been some suggestions recently that there's a potential new oil and gas resource in Queensland. Queensland Premier's been talking it up. I think it's very, very early days as to whether that's real or not, and is it of a size that would justify the enthusiasm that we're seeing. So, it seems to me that, looking for more oil, being able to process it ourselves is going to be a really long-term hard challenge. There are better things we could be doing. One of them, of course, is to really continue to push our acceleration of electric vehicles. 2 reasons. One is because it reduces our dependence upon the sort of problems we've been talking about. And secondly, it also is consistent with reducing our impact on climate change. And it means that we can do both. That would seem to be a double benefit for going down that route. At the same time, probably looking to increase the level of storage we have on shore, and also probably, this is a little bit less clear, what the government's been talking about, to produce biodiesel rather than fossil diesel.
Coming up, will Albanese's flash trip to Singapore help Australia's fuel problems?
This is a relationship of trust and of mutual interest as well. We know that it is in both of our countries' interests to engage with each other, to make sure that we are both reliable suppliers and our word means something.
Tony, Anthony Albanese has flown to Singapore to meet with his counterpart, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. You've touched upon it, but why is Singapore so important to Australia's fuel needs?
Well, there's 3 finished products we use. One is petrol, one is diesel, one is aviation fuel. Now, people who've been queuing up at Bowsers know that there's a couple of variations on that, but fundamentally that's what we're talking about. Now, we buy about half of our petrol from Singapore. Big refineries they've got there, very important for us. The other side of why Singapore is interesting is because Australia, in this part of the world, is a globally important supplier of LNG. And now even more so with what's happened to Qatar. And so Singapore has some very important challenges because they produce 90% of their electricity from gas. So they need us, we need them. You can see the opportunity for reciprocal arrangement. Now, governments do not do commercial deals. Governments do not threaten each other with, unless you do this, I'm going to do that. What they do is say, let's work together and see if we can find some solutions here that are going to be better for both of us. Clearly, we both countries have got a very strong common interest, and that's what I think Prime Minister of Australia is trying to shore up with the Prime Minister of Singapore. For example, not doing commercial deals, but making it very clear that the government is not going to intervene in ways that adversely affect Singapore, and looking for assurances the Singapore government won't do the same thing. Remembering that Singapore produces more fuel than they need. How they allocate that will be important for us.
So, in purely political terms, what can Albanese realistically achieve during his visit, Tony?
Look, I think the highest priority would be two things. Firstly, we know reciprocally what we're planning to do if things don't improve. And what I mean by that is that if Singapore will not, if they do decide they've got some real problems meeting all their customers' requirements for the products they produce, that we won't be adversely affected by that. I mean, there's no guarantees here, but equally, they'll be looking at the same thing. We won't be doing anything on the LNG side that would affect them. Now, that's the political decision. At the same time, obviously, there will be a lot of interest in the way that will work out commercially. Longer term, what I think this does is absolutely supports a better long-term relationship with Singapore, because if we are going to be dependent upon imported fuels for some time yet, and I think it's quite likely, then deepening those relationships with countries like Singapore and Malaysia and so forth makes a lot of sense. And secondly, as we think about building our own onshore storage, that will also be important. So I think there's two levels of arrangements that the Prime Minister's visit could bring to a future.
Beyond the Singapore trip, the government has announced a series of measures, underwriting extra shipments, cutting excise further with states, releasing 20% of the minimum stock holding obligation, changing fuel standards and backing some of the refineries that we do have. So how would you rate the government's response to this so far?
Look, I think the government, in terms of responding as they needed to a situation that's been developing very rapidly, has been pretty good, actually. They were trying to run a fine line between being too optimistic and too pessimistic. And so, this idea that as soon as the government says don't panic, what does everybody do? Panic, of course. That's what happens, right? So the government was trying to assure people that, and so far it's been true, overall, Australia has not run out of fuel. What we have done is paying more for it. And secondly, because of our large country, we're on the end of, and many people in regional Australia are in longer supply chains. When you start to see panic buying in those supply chains, then quickly you can get local problems. So I think broadly speaking, what the government's done has been appropriate. But I think most Australians will say, okay, we understand this wasn't caused by Australia. We're comfortable with what the government's doing. We all know if it gets worse, we're going to have to do our part. Let's get on with that.
A question you may or may not be able to answer, Tony, but it's something that's always sort of fascinated me since this thing broke out, is that during normal times, do we have any sort of idea of how many servos would actually run out of petrol on a normal day?
You'd like to think zero, wouldn't you? Look, I think it does happen from time to time. I mean, I've driven up the Strait Highway from Adelaide to Darwin a couple of times, and it's not that unusual to come to one that is out of one particular fuel, like diesel or petrol or something like that, or a particular unleaded petrol or something. So it's not off the planet at all. But I can recall when we did have more refineries in this country, it seemed to me that we had more disruptions to supply because there was in those days a very strong unionised workforce, and we'd have industrial disputation more than we had physical disputation. And so, I think this actually overall, our fuel supply has been pretty good. But I think it's important that we be thinking about what level of insurance do we want to have against this thing happening in the future. And we've had pretty small, relatively small stocks of fuel on shore. We may have to revisit that. The need for that has changed a lot because we still produce crude oil. When we used to also refine it ourselves, we didn't need to have the same amount of onshore storage as we probably do today.
And finally, Tony, a very simple question, really. What's the best case scenario here and what's the worst case scenario? And how long could we be feeling the impacts of this?
Look, I think the best case would be if both sides, I mean, remember there are three sides to this bloody thing, with Israel having its own very particular view, not necessarily aligned with the United States. They've got to find a way to back out of this, withdraw, bring it all down, get some serious negotiations going on. Very tricky, very sensitive. It only requires someone to say the wrong thing on the wrong media interview. It all goes to hell, right?
But be careful what you say, Tony.
Bob, you got it. Now, the worst case, obviously, if that doesn't happen, the most dramatically worst case would be if something like what Donald Trump was threatening actually happened. If we did fundamentally wipe out the physical infrastructure in the way that Trump was talking about, recovery would take a lot longer. The consequences would be a lot worse. That would be so bad that I don't think a lot will be done to avoid that happening.
Well, Tony, we thank you for your insights and we thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
"7am is a daily show from Solstice Media. It's made by Atticus Bastow, Ariel Richards, Chris Dengate, Crystal Keller, Nicole Johnston, Travis Evans, Zoltan Fetcho, and me, Daniel James. Our theme music is by Ned Beckley and Josh Hogan of Envelope Audio. Thank you for listening to 7am this week. Please have yourself a great weekend.